For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Jeff here with something we're really excited about. We've got Dr. David Spence. He's the chair in natural resources law at the University of Texas. He is also the author of a recent book, The Climate of Contempt. The premise of the book is we're not making good climate policy because we're not having good climate discussions. At least that would be my quick summary. Dr. Spence will give us a lot of the details, but it's a fascinating expose on really, I would say, Dr. Spence, on how we're making policy in America today and what some of the issues are with our polarized society and why we can't have more substantive conversations about a lot of issues. So this is almost dovetails nicely with election season. But let me just stop here and say, Dr. Spence, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about this.
Well, we're super excited. Mike, what would you tell us, including Dr. Spence, about the market?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting week. So far. If you compare it to last week, I think most people have been pretty bullish about the markets because most people expect the Fed is going to be cutting rates, and they have cut rates by 50 basis points. But what's happened here over the last 2 weeks is that the 10-year yield has gone from like 3.65 to over 4% today. And that's because economic stats, the jobs report last week came out a little bit more hotter than expected. And so we've had a rally back up in rates. This week it's going to be really interesting because on Thursday you're going to get a CPI reading. Friday you're going to get a PPI reading, and you're going to get consumer sentiment. So there's a lot of big economic stats that are here, and before the end of the week, it's really going to determine what the Fed's next move is. Are they going to be raising 50 basis points or 25 basis points? I think most people expect they're going to raise 25 basis points twice, so another 50 basis points. But markets right now have gotten a little bit more skeptical on that. I'd say the other thing that we're looking at right now is crude oil today is down. It's early today. It's down about $3 a barrel. We've rallied about $9 a barrel over the last week or so. And a lot of that is because of tensions in the Middle East. What is Israel going to do? Are they going to strike Iranian nuclear facilities? Are they going to strike Iranian oil facilities? And, one of the things we talked about probably for the last 3 or 4 weeks was, Brent crude oil, the amount of basically short interest, how bearish the setup was. And that was just because of supply and demand dynamics into 2025 weighing on crude oil. That has now, caused a reversal in crude oil because people are basically scrambling. We basically pushed crude oil above, 250-day, 100-day moving averages. So there's both a technical aspect and just a fear aspect. And so crude oil is down today, $3, like I said earlier, is because China seems like, they're kind of waffling a little bit on their economic stimulus. So that's what's taking prices down today, and then copper is down as well today. So it's really kind of a China dynamic. And so I think that's where we are right now. I think the key things going forward is, what is going to happen with Israel and Iran. If Iran strikes if Iran gets struck, how many barrels were offline? Incidentally, this week you've had Libyan barrels come back around 300,000 to 400,000 barrels of Libyan production. So I think right now we just got to find out what Israel's going to do, what they strike, how much barrels are offline, if that even happens. And then you have a December 1st OPEC meeting on them deciding how many barrels they're going to be bringing back into the market. And so I think depending on how many barrels they're going to be bringing back to the market is really going to be dictated on what happens here in the next couple of weeks with Israel, Iran. So that's where markets are, both from an economic standpoint or from a crude oil standpoint.
Well, and we start earnings next week?
We start with Liberty, I believe, on the 16th of October. They're really out of the gate first, and then they always go with Halliburton, Schlumberger, and Baker. So it's really the oil service guys first, but Liberty's out of the gate first. So it'll be very interesting to see what they say about North American, dynamics, especially its fracking business. So yeah, it's going to get heavy into the end of October and early November.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, anything you'd add as we jump in?
I was just listening to Mike. The kind of the ironic thing is the things that seem to be driving energy stocks and new commodities are kind of from a trading standpoint are kind of contrary to what I think drives structural value. So the underlying economy being better is good for energy broadly because that means demand's growing. And then turmoil in the Middle East and supply disruption, sure, that may help price in the near term, but historically that's bad for the stock structurally. So the things that are good from a trading standpoint, likely aren't good structurally, and perhaps vice versa.
That is really interesting. Well, Dr. Spence, we jumped in there and talked a little bit about the markets, and I think we always do that. And I would say replaying some of those conversations, political and geopolitical dynamics have always been a flavor, certainly for a while. The world's economic health has definitely been a flavor, and big variables like China are always important. So you got a nice primer on how we think and what we're always talking about. But let me just say again, we're so glad to have you, and let me publicly thank Barbara Berger. She connected us and made the introduction. So we're delighted to meet you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You guys are talking about things my students ask me about all the time. What's going to happen to the price of oil? What's going to happen to price of natural gas? And I always demur. You guys are doing the hard work.
Well,
we're talking about that stuff.
We should too. I mean, I'm remembering you had that quote in the book where you said, predictions are really hard, particularly about the future, which that was kind of a fun one.
Yeah.
Well,
one of the many misattributed quotes online. Yogi Berra never said that. Yeah.
It does sound a little bit like Yogi.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's jump in. We've all read the book. We've done our homework. We really enjoyed it. Thank you for all the effort that we know that goes into something like that. You had one comment in the book I might start with, because I mentioned the premise that the premise is really kind of why aren't we getting better policy, and you go through a lot of reasons why you explain why you think we're not getting better policy. But one of the comments I was struck by, and it's a theme of your book, which is people should get outside their comfort zones. They should connect with people that they can really have good, honest discussion with and good, honest debate. And one of your quotes was, I stay in Texas for this reason. Like, I am around energy people here at the university and in Austin. I'm just as likely to run into a Republican as a Democrat. So it was an interesting comment you make about you choose to live your life in a place where you're going to have good, open, honest debate. And I was just struck by that comment. We should all maybe think a little bit more like that. But maybe that's a good place to start.
Sure. So let me back up a little bit. I'm a professor of energy law and policy, and I have been for a very, very long time. And I started to notice that students were having a more difficult time on their own learning about the sort of full complexity of energy regulatory issues, among other complex issues, and that politics seemed to be changing around those issues in ways that I think were contributing to their difficulties, right? And so I suspected that the changes in the modern information environment, meaning social media, advocacy media, were contributing to that. And when I went to do research on the question, I found that lo and behold, there was a huge body of literature describing how the new media environment is sort of destructive to our ability to understand the whole truth. And so that's really what drove the book. And so the prescription that we point to toward the end of the book is about sort of trying to undo some of those harmful effects. And you're absolutely right. That quote is central to the book. The idea that we have to start talking to each other across these ideological and partisan boundaries, preferably face to face, because discussion online is an entirely different animal, and it's not as conducive to learning from one another.
It was awfully early in the intro for me to mention the election, but I'll just share an observation that I've had. Was if you look at social media, and I'm probably particularly talking about Facebook, I'll see a lot of political postings, but my observation on the political postings is they happen in little bubbles. So like a person who has a certain viewpoint posts a viewpoint and then all their friends agree. And then another person who has a different viewpoint posts an opinion and then all their friends agree. And so there is no communication going on this is maybe a sweeping comment, but there's no real communication going on that is educating or informing or asking questions or helping people understand complexity. There's just little bubbles where people post whatever their view is, and then all their friends agree.
I think that's not a bad summary of what happens on social media, at least with respect to politics. The algorithms do put us in bubbles, and they tend to be ideologically homogenous, people that agree with us on most things. It's rare for at least the thoughtful versions of the opposing viewpoint to ever enter our individual bubbles. And what if the other side does enter our bubble, it's usually some, horrible story that caricatures people on the other side, and it helps us sort of create a picture of them in our mind's eye that's not very realistic and is much more negative than they deserve. And that's what the research says too. So I think your summary was essentially right.
I guess I noticed nobody's really convincing anybody of anything, or we're not necessarily using it as the tool we might hope. Maybe I could just ask you, since you wrote the book, what's been the reaction? What have been some of the places you've gone to discuss the book? What kind of feedback have you been getting? It's always interesting to hear kind of the once you release it, what sort of the reverberations, good, bad, and indifferent.
Well, I've been going around the country talking, mainly the eastern part of the country so far, talking about the book to university audiences. It is an academic book, so I appreciate you guys plowing through it. There's some parts of it are not a breezy read, I know. But
hey, we're tough, Dr. Spence. We're getting better,
Yeah, please. By the way, please call me David.
Okay.
Dr.
Well,
Spence.
it's probably a university throwback. You're supposed to call your professor Dr. Spence.
Yeah. That's we all.
All right, we're doing it, David. You got it.
Yeah,
You're stuck with us now.
Yeah, the reaction has been terrific. I mean, every place I've gone, I've gotten lots and lots of questions about the book, and usually the audiences are sort of half students and half faculty or other people, sort of my peers. And I notice if I'm reading facial expressions correctly and questions correctly, that the critique of the modern information environment really resonates with students, because they're the ones that grew up with it. They understand or feel as though they're being spun all the time. So much of the information they encounter online is designed to persuade them before it's designed to educate them. And so they sort of shake their heads while I'm talking about that part of the book, which is essentially chapter 4 of the book. And then the questions that come afterwards are either from young people about sort of what do we do about this, or from older people who may not be as online as younger people and have never really experienced the sort of nasty side of the online political discussion, and they didn't know it existed, and they're sort of doubtful about it. And so those are the sort of two sets of reactions I get, but the discussions have been, robust and terrific. And I've given about 10 or 15 talks so far, and every one of them has included questions that go right to the end of the designated period and beyond.
What do you make of the? Because it seems like in a world that disagrees about a lot, it seems like, honestly, almost everyone agrees that social media has some of these negative effects, and that people are advocating as opposed to, it's all those things you just described. So ironically, there's a lot of agreement on the nature of all this, and then you see very different potential approaches. Like one group seems to be saying, hey, we have a problem here, we need to stop misinformation. There's sort of the what do we do about misinformation camp. And then there's another camp which is the only thing worse than misinformation would be regulation of misinformation. And these camps are very different animals. You kind of see it in the, I don't know, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but the Brazil Twitter sort of debates, and you see it around, you saw it around COVID, and there's this, what do you make of that debate, and how are we going to come up with some policies that address all this, or is this sort of like 1900 America when we had terrible journalism and eventually it had to sort itself out because only the credible survived. Like what do you see as a prescription for all this?
Yeah, so the fact that everybody sort of agrees that this problem is out there you'd think that would be sort of the first step toward finding a solution. But people feel dependent upon these dominant platforms. I think everyone, and scholars and lay people alike, agree that Twitter is one of the sort of worst places to talk about politics for a variety of reasons, not only the sorting that I described earlier, but also the space limitations, the presence of a potential audience that changes the way we talk to each other. There's a lot of things wrong with trying to talk about politics on Twitter, X, Twitter/X, as I call it in the book. Yeah. And it is essentially unregulated. And it's true that if you read the political analysis and the analysis of congressional politics in the book, you know that if Twitter and these platforms had been created, say, 50 years ago, there's probably a chance that they might have been regulated in some way because the political environment was very different then. But it's a very delicate thing because it involves speech and government. The Constitution restricts government's ability to restrict speech. It's not an absolute right. We can do it in certain ways. But my hope is that people will learn that part of what they encounter online is information that's there to harm their understanding anyway. And that we can recognize that the internet is still young in the historical sense. And perhaps we can become more sophisticated and intelligent users of that medium and change the way we talk about things online if we have to be online to talk about these things.
Well, one question, it's not necessarily something you address in the book, because you do have some great thoughts for how a lot of this could be improved, but it does seem like you're not sure if it's kind of chicken and egg, but leadership, whether it's from the Oval Office or from the CEO, or you pick your leader, the university president, if leadership would wade in and say, whoever they represent, if they would try to find accommodation and speak to, I'll just give you an example. If Trump said, I really don't like the way Marjorie Taylor Greene behaves, and we should stop doing that. Or if Biden said, I feel like AOC is not being productive right now, I think we need to, or I'm trying to give some examples that frame what I'm trying to say. Is the problem really this world we're living in, or is the problem we don't have leadership? For some reason, leadership is no longer providing that special sauce which brings us together. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that part of the reason leaders of political parties are reluctant to publicly slap down their own members is because our politics today punish them for doing that. And let me explain what I mean by that. So, as you know, our partisan divisions are sort of roughly 50-50 out there, and that we have much more intense disagreement about what good policy means between the two parties. And because members of Congress mostly represent what political scientists call safe districts, meaning the dominance of one party among the voters in that district is so overwhelming that the nominee of that party doesn't really face any risk of losing the general election. The risk they face of losing is in the primary, right? So the people who vote in primaries are more extreme than they used to be ideologically, and more negatively partisan, meaning there's much more partisan animosity out there between the parties than there used to be. This is something I trace to the internet and the modern information environment. And so if that's how you protect your electoral future, then you have to respect those negatively partisan extreme people in order to stay in office. And if the leader of your party doesn't like what you're saying, what they don't like even more is losing the majority that your party might have in Congress, or the chance of earning that majority. And so that's where we get these incentives that, encourage this extreme behavior and discourage people from, stopping it.
Well, it's kind of hard. I kind of apologize. I pulled this off in a slightly political direction, but it's just, it is election season. So I think it's on everyone's mind that at some level we would love better debate and discussion, regardless of what the issue is. Maybe I could ask you maybe a more specific climate question, if you don't mind, which is, your premise of the book, the central thesis is that there's generally speaking a majority of the population is concerned about climate, and then you take that concern and try to understand what is the political system, how is it reacting to it, what is it doing, what proposals and policies are coming out the back end of a majority concern. I guess my question was, and then at the end you really wrap it up quite nicely with a discussion of kind of ways to balance all these concerns and what that might mean for policy. But I guess the specific question is, do you see part of the problem here is it's kind of one thing to be concerned about climate, but it's quite another to come up with a prescription for it. So one explanation, right, is we have concern that's not being addressed, but another explanation is we have concern that, okay, how do I address it, and what priority, and how much do I spend, and how does it compare to other things? Like, how do you think about translating that sentiment into policy?
Yeah, that's a very good question that reflects a perceptive reading of the book.
Well, you have to forgive us. We do this like every Tuesday for 4 years, so we're like the ultimate nerds about all this stuff.
Yeah, so it is. I do believe that there's a pretty clear majority of people who are concerned about climate change, and that group is probably growing as we, experience some increasing number of effects of climate change, particularly costly effects, financially costly effects. And so a lot of my peers would say, well, why don't we have stronger climate policy if people want it? And the analysis I just gave you about politics in Congress is part of the answer to that. But people are also concerned about having affordable and secure energy at the same time. And politicians know that they're more likely to lose their job if they don't provide those two things than they are if they fail to provide a sort of cleaner energy mix. And so, how we get to that cleaner energy mix or really an energy mix that just emits less carbon into the atmosphere, because that's what's causing these climate effects, is the concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere. And so that process involves a lot of difficult choices and trade-offs and situations that are not win-win, right? And so if we can't talk about those with each other, we're not going to make any progress on those things. I mean, there are some win-win opportunities out there, but we have are sort of two sides of a political debate that tend to downplay the negatives of their own perspective and try to get people to focus on the positives of their own perspective, which means we're not getting any conversation about those difficult parts in the middle. And that's what chapter 5 of the book is all about, sort of identifying those difficult parts in the middle, the trade-offs associated with a transition to a lower carbon emission economy, and hopefully getting us to talk about those transparently, because sweeping them under the rug is completely counterproductive.
Maybe I could ask you, one of the fuels or the boundaries, if you will, in the discussion, it often strikes us as natural gas, right? Because natural gas is the plentiful, affordable, not perfect fuel. I think that's maybe a decent description of it. And so it's a boundary fuel, and meaning, I think our perception is, guys, I'm speaking for all of us, so forgive me, but it's a fuel where if you say, I'm all in on it. And, let's address methane leaks. And, if you say that, then that implies a certain energy policy. And if you say that's a fossil fuel, I'm out. We have to it's got to be pulled out of the system as soon as possible. That implies a much different policy. So it's almost a flavor. It almost embodies moderate energy policy. Mm-hmm. So how do you see it that way? Does natural gas stick out to you as that flavor? I'm just curious because you've seen all sides of this. You've written about it. You talk to people who do policy. How do you see that flavor in particular in this discussion?
I try to be militantly, technologically agnostic about the future, if only because I've been at this a long time and we're not very good about predicting technological change, in my opinion. The first edition of the casebook that I was co-author of, a law school textbook, predicted that we wouldn't be able to get to shale oil and gas for 100 years.
Yeah.
10 years later, we were all over it.
We love to say that around here. Shale taught us all a lesson about don't ever say never,
Right. And the same thing with the rapidity of the decline in the cost of solar. I don't think anybody predicted that. And so what I say about the question you asked is that we need to keep our eyes on the prize. It's not about what the fuel is. It's about what the emissions are, right? So it's true that if we want to sort of get to a net zero addition of carbon to the atmosphere, we want to stop adding carbon to the atmosphere on a net basis, then we need to find backup technologies for wind and solar that are clean in that sense, net zero. Now, I don't know if that's going to be natural gas plus carbon capture and sequestration. It could be, and it would be fine with me if it was, or geothermal, or, some kind of new storage technology that can be cost effective for longer than a lithium ion battery can be, or nuclear, or whatever it is. We're going to need some dispatchable electricity generation technologies that are net zero carbon. And in the meantime, natural gas, at least in certain places, is environmentally beneficial when it displaces coal. And so from the point of view of focusing on the energy transition and how to stop ourselves from adding more carbon to the atmosphere, I don't take a position on fuels. I take a position on the emissions that are associated with their use.
David, I thought one of the interesting aspects of the book is when you talked about 3 Mile Island, about your early in your days, you saw that incident, you were, you kind of were like, we got to phase this out. And I think a lot of that was sort of a fear factor. And then as you educated yourself, you kind of came around. And the reason I brought that up is just so a week ago, 2 weeks ago, Constellation Energy struck a deal with Microsoft to open up one of the 3 Mile, not the unit that melted down, but one of the other units that was shut down because of economics. And I guess my question for you is you changed your thinking 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. Some of these power companies that are now striking these deals were not for nuclear. They've really kind of gravitated to nuclear. Instead of thinking about them, maybe talk about your students. I mean, I turn on College Game Day every week and I see, these nuclear posters. Most of them are at Texas A&M, but maybe kind of talk about your students, where they were, in order, sort of 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, where they are today, and how do you think they're going to influence policy, not only from nuclear, but maybe the natural gas like Maynard talked about?
Yeah. I mean, I was 20 years old when that happened, right? And I was living close to 3 Mile Island. And as I say in the book, and I especially detail it in one of the footnotes or the endnotes, I was influenced by sort of the social and even the sort of popular culture treatments of nuclear at the time. And you probably, you may remember the China Syndrome, the movie.
Oh, yeah.
Or you may remember Silkwood, the movie. And I was a big popular music fan, and all my favorite musicians were sort of in these no nukes concerts and things. So I was influenced by that as a college kid, right? And it was only when I started working in the industry and got a more sort of quantitative understanding of the risk profile of nuclear that I sort of started to change my thinking. And I think that's sort of how life goes, right? I mean, we as young people, we might become too certain about things too quickly. And the problem today is that with the internet and with these isolated bubbles of information, that premature certainty is reinforced all the time. It's like a devil on your shoulder processing every piece of information through an ideological or a partisan lens. And that to me is a problem, because I think it's allowing these false beliefs to persist longer than they otherwise might, right? And so, a lot of the problem we're diagnosing in the book and trying to give advice on how to get around is about that element of things distorting our perception. I think it's true of every technology that the more you learn about it, the more ambiguous or morally ambiguous and gray it seems. Just the other day, I learned that geothermal wells, deep enhanced geothermal wells, are essentially mining heat that dissipates over time, and it's sort of like a hydraulically fractured well. You have a curve of production that goes down pretty steeply, right? And so I didn't know that before, or I didn't know that carbon capture at natural gas-fired power plants can, according to a colleague of mine who just did a study, can produce a chemical reaction in the atmosphere that adds fine particles to the atmosphere, which are, not good for human health. Or, every technology has something about it that is a negative, right? And so, but what we see online and what my students see online is sort of boosterism or anti-boosterism about technologies that sort of tries to cover up parts of the story. And that's the problem we're combating here. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I gave you some thoughts on it anyway.
I think keeping with that thread, because at the core of it, you're talking about being open with the trade-offs, with any choice or any technology. Too often it's either you use the word boosterism or emotional, or something is portrayed in an idealistic fashion. But it seems like, to Maynard's earlier question, leadership and discussion of a topic, it strikes me as way more credentializing to provide a little bit more well-rounded discussion. Nothing's perfect. Nothing is clean, cheap, abundant, and has no externalities. Why do you think it is difficult, or what do you think will be a catalyst for just a more robust discussion of trade-offs and more holistic discussion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the book is really about talking about the bottom-up part of the political process, and appreciating the fact that political leaders, I should say, elected political leaders, are responding to the incentives they face. And we would like for them to sort of step outside those incentives at time and lead in ways that try to steer us back toward the whole truth. It's hard for politicians to do that, apparently. Precious few politicians are willing to buck those incentives. And I do think it's fair to talk about this, talk about what the literature says about this. And what the literature says is that there's more misinformation spreading around on the right than there is on the left, but it comes from both sides. And so we have to sort of celebrate and try to encourage those leaders who are willing to buck those electoral incentives and talk about the truth, even if it's an inconvenient truth for their own side. And that's true on both sides of the aisle. I don't think I'm discouraged by the reluctance of so many leaders so far to do that. And I think lots of people are, but it's a testament to the power of the sort of modern information system that whips up people's fear and drives them to vote in ways that are associated with those fears. That politicians are unwilling to do that. My best hope, my hope lies in people getting more savvy about and recognizing as time goes by that the information that they believe, the false beliefs they're holding, are not serving them well. Eventually, that will come back to bite people. You remember the guy that showed up at the pizza place in Washington, D.C. with an AR-15, sincerely believing that he was going to break up a child trafficking ring. And when he was arrested, he said, I guess I had bad information. And that, he was in a bubble, in his case, a QAnon bubble, but a bubble where he was sincere in his belief that he thought that was happening. And we're all in some kind of bubble. It's not always that dramatic or that far from the truth, but we're all in bubbles and we have to get out of them. And I think we'll learn over time that some of the things we thought were true weren't, and that, we're going to pay some sort of cost for that. And I hope that as we mature with this technology, we get better about separating the wheat from the chaff.
We had, it was just when you said that, that last comment on mature with the technology, we had late last year, we had Barry Weiss at an event just in our community. And I think her comment was, I'll mess up the quote, but it was something to the effect of, we will look back on an era when we gave children iPhones with, no restricted access. We will look back on this as the craziest period, in our history, or something to that effect. Like, it just, when you just made that comment, I was remembering that quote of hers, and I thought that was quite impressive.
Yeah, I think in France, they're now experimenting with what they call digital pauses for children, and preventing them from using them in certain times in certain places. And I think this idea of restricting access to the internet in recognition of the amount of information on there that's designed to harm us is wise. Timothy Snyder, the historian who wrote on tyranny, which is kind of a bestseller, so we just need to recognize that there's a lot of information out there that is not designed to help us in any way live better lives. And so it's designed to push us towards some objective that the disseminator of that information has, which is not our own, objective.
So one question, because you mentioned it in with your interaction there with Jeff about fear and the use of fear, and you had this quote in the book. I'll mess it up, but it was something like, "There's a fine line between ambition and alarmism is a fine one," I think was the quote. And I think this is something that a lot of people use fear to get what they want. If we don't do such and such, this terrible thing is going to happen. We've got to do it. We can't talk about it. We have to move now. That's been used by all sides in a lot of policy issues. I guess two questions on that. Why are politicians seemingly going to that move more and more often, the fear move? And then the second one would be, I think an observation on climate would be the best way to solve it would be in a level-headed way, as opposed to oh my gosh, if we don't attack this with everything we have in the most immediate, because I think our observation on the second one is then you're going to get collateral damage that is really concerning and may not even help the climate. So talk about fear, the use of fear, why we're responding to it, why people are using it so much. It does seem to be a new feature of the landscape, or an enhanced feature of the landscape of the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, I would endorse that latter phrasing. So politicians and political operatives have always tried to invoke voter fear to try and steer people toward a particular conclusion. And this is what sort of the political professionals would call defining the other side, and often in a very negative way that appeals to voters' fear. And so you have a set of voters now who have been, become very, very fearful about what climate change means for their future and their children's future. And we have another set of voters who are very, very fearful about what the steps that the other side wants to take to address that mean for their future and their children's future. And so each side is, invoking fear as politicians have since the beginning of politics. But what's different, and why I think your phrasing of it as enhanced nowadays makes sense, is that the technology for doing so is just infinitely more powerful than it ever has been. We never had in human history, we've never had the ability to sort of constantly 24/7, 365 frame every new piece of news in ways that stoke fear the way we do now. So we have this tremendous not intentional coordination, but coordination between all the different kinds of ideological media out there. You see it on a broadcast channel, whether it's Fox or MSNBC, and then you go to your social media group and you talk about it there. And then there's sort of online podcasters who pick up the same language, the same framing. And it's just constant stoking of fear. And when people are afraid, that's when they're most easily led in very dangerous directions. I think one of the epigrams in my book is from Voltaire. Those who make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. It's a really bad situation when masses of people are afraid, and it just really distorts our ability to do politics in a productive way.
So one question, maybe a little more, just getting back to energy a little bit. I think when I was tempted to call you Dr. Spence again, David. When we think about the next 10 years in energy, I think what looks to be the case is that we're going to use a lot more energy in the developed world, right? It just looks to be the case. We're going to use a lot more energy. If you look at Mike's always talking about the power companies that are doing estimates of increases in power need, and you just look at various things happening. It looks like the developed world needs more energy. And then it looks like the developing world needs more energy. So this adds up to 8 billion people going to 10 billion people, all of which want more energy. And then you look at this, the framework of some of the proposed changes around decarbonization, and you look at the combination of the two. We need more, and we're going to make change. That just looks like it's going to spit out more cost in total and per person for energy. That seems to be the glide path we're staring into right now. So I'm just curious, does it, from your seat and from the book's perspective, where you're thinking so much about decarbonization and the politics around it, does that basic outlook resonate with you? Does it feel that way to you? Because if you thought energy was going to be flat or even going down, that would be, one set of policies would occur to you. But in an environment where demand is going up, that affects your kind of how you think about it. But I'm just curious what you think about that.
So I would agree with the premise of your question that both parts of the world are going to use a lot more energy in the future. And in my view, it would be unethical to deny the developing world that new energy just because, it might, just because it might, increase the scope of the problem that we're facing. So I accept that part of the question. And I'm trying to be agnostic about trade-offs, but it's definitely true that it's entirely possible that decarbonizing while we grow the energy system will result in more expensive energy. There's a lot of people who look at the levelized cost of electricity from wind and solar and see how low it is and sort of jump to the conclusion that means a heavily or all wind and solar energy system would be cheap. And that's, of course, not true because it will require lots of other technologies to back up wind and solar, and those might be more expensive. And in fact, wind and solar might be more expensive if we rely on it so much that we can't use all of the output that a particular wind and solar generator will generate. And so, it could be more expensive, and that's something we need to be transparent about. Now, the only caveat to that is that while I say in the book that we can't predict where technological great leaps forward will happen, it's pretty likely that in the next 30 years, there'll be at least one or two. And I don't know where those will be.
But
well,
we hope so. The world
I hope
won't
so
be as
too.
Interesting if that's not true.
It might be that, it's somebody could come up with something new that we haven't thought of that could, make that problem a lot easier to manage.
Something that has been coming up, or we feel like we're noticing as whether it's states or countries, but, and you talk about this in the book, people have different approaches to energy that results in different energy/environmental environments. California is different from Texas, is different from the UK, is different from, pick a place. But what sort of seems to be happening, and you talk about costs going up and how that hurts lower income people in particular. The other thing that seems to be happening is industry is choosing to locate their operations, particularly energy intensive industries. They're going to the places with the cheaper power. They think about a lot of other things, but they're moving to those places. And so over time, that means, just to put a finer point on it, you're less likely to put that next plant in Germany or California and more likely to put it in Texas, just to, choose a place. That then has implications about the economy and jobs and economic strength and so on and so forth. Is that a perception that you have of how the world, and that's a slow thing, right? That doesn't happen week by week. It happens year by year by year. Is that something you, in your class or in your travels, that you find is more and more on the radar as a concern?
I think the question as you framed it is generally right, with one caveat though. If the energy in question is electricity, sometimes we're seeing certain industries like Bitcoin miners, for example, going to little pockets of the electric grid that are served by places that have a glut of either solar or wind. And that's because that's on a spot price basis, really, really cheap energy. And that's what they need, right? And so that would be the exception, I think, to that rule. But in Texas, it's a big exception because they've just come flooding into parts of the grid where we had too much wind. And I believe in the Mojave, there's been a few Bitcoin miners going out to the Mojave Desert for the same reason. But yeah, that's true. I think that there are larger sort of economy-wide effects associated with decarbonization strategies, especially if not undertaken wisely, and those are just some of them, right? So, I don't know what the industrial policy represented by the Inflation Reduction Act will mean for sort of international trade policy, right? So far, it hasn't really produced the kind of trade wars that have hurt us, but maybe it will. I don't know what huge deficits mean for the future. I'm not a macroeconomist, right? And so these are beyond my expertise and really beyond the scope of the book, although I mention them as potential risks. Mm-hmm. And so all of these second order effects that are raised by your question, they're all out there and we're waiting to see what's going to become of them. And I kind of wish we were talking about them too, within this debate over decarbonization. But and none of this quells, I don't think any of this needs to quell our ambition or our willingness to pursue the goal of reducing our carbon emissions. But it does need to inform that discussion. Mm. And that's a big part of what the book is all about.
Mm. David, Maynard kind of hit it on the head just a little while ago. I mean, and I think you talked about this in your first chapter about regulatory, regulation of the energy market, FERC 636, take or pays with the, pipeline companies, near and dear to my heart. That when I started my career, that was just one of the things that we dealt with. It was brutal, but that was in a market where there wasn't really any growth. Now you have growth basically going, just crazy. Okay. And so I worry from a regulatory standpoint that we're chasing this. We're not getting out, we're not getting out in front of it. We're making bad policy because we're chasing it. And so I guess my question, and to compound that, maybe this is an opportunity, maybe this isn't, but we had the Chevron deference case earlier in the year where they're basically pushing, all this regulatory issue back to the courts, back to Congress, and away from these three-letter agencies. In your opinion, does that have the potential to bring Congress more together to create better policy, or is it just muddy the waters? How do you think about that? Is it an opportunity, or is it just a real big setback in, for the energy transition?
Certainly, from the Supreme Court's point of view, that's part of what they're trying to do. They say that these are questions we'd like Congress to stop avoiding. From a political science research point of view, that seems like a tall order, because there are reasons why Congress avoid these issues in the first place, political reasons that serve the interests of individual members. And there's also good reasons to delegate as well. Some of the biggest mistakes in the history of energy policy were made by courts or Congress. And that's partly why they delegate, that not just because they're hard choices that they don't want to take political responsibility for, but also because they're choices that ought to be made by experts deliberating away from political pressures. I give the court, I take the court at its word that that's why they're trying to do this. And from a democratic theory point of view, it's an understandable objective, but I'm very skeptical that it's going to have the effects that they think it's going to have, or they want it to have. I think we're going to be stuck in a sort of paralyzed situation where Congress remains dysfunctional and the energy agencies are sort of kneecapped or restricted in their ability to address these kinds of problems. And I know that sounds like a dismal prediction, but that's sort of the way I see it based on the empirical literature as I understand it.
We spent a lot of time talking about the political environment, and kind of our political structure and why we've ended up with the discussion this way. I wanted to think about, how we move forward in energy policy, in a little bit different way, in terms of we kind of have, I think about it, three buckets. You kind of academia, government, and the commercial world. Are those three buckets as disparate as we see in the political environment? Are we seeing anything that makes us more constructive about their ability to work together? I don't perceive so, but I'm asking you.
No, I think the world of politicians is a pretty unique world, and I think there's a lot more agreement out there, or at least potential for cross-boundary productive discussion outside of the political environment. So, for example, you see the super majors, just issuing a statement of preference that the Inflation Reduction Act not be entirely repealed, right? So there's lots of agreement, lots of points of specific agreement, once you get away from running it through the partisan lens. And we even see this sometimes creep into policy when it comes to specific things like the Advance Act, another statute this past session that provides some additional supports for development of nuclear power plants. And so, if we stop short of sort of greenhouse gas emissions regulation, I think there's still possibility for productive agreement across ideological and party boundaries on very specific, narrow things. They're not the things that collectively get us to net zero, but they can certainly help us move in the right direction. And if you talk to industrial leaders or business leaders, most of them understand that climate science, indicates that human behavior is causing this problem, and most of them take it seriously because it imposes risks for their business, big risks, and particularly financial risks, and so they're looking for ways to try and mitigate those effects. But once it gets put into the meat grinder of national partisan labeling, it becomes a lot harder to translate into national policy, which is a way of saying that the progress can be made at the state level in some places. I don't mean to be entirely negative by focusing on Congress and the U.S. Congress. That's sort of the worst place to try and find this common ground. It can be found elsewhere. By the way, let me just give a plug to a friend of mine who's mentioned in the last chapter, who does a lot of research on private action to try and make, practical progress in climate change. Mike Vandenberg at Vanderbilt University, his research is described in that last chapter, and there's certainly a lot of progress that can be made there as well.
David, I feel like I've got this precious resource now I have like about 3 minutes left with you. And how are we going to allocate that precious resource? This is a metaphor for life here. Maybe one, and you touch on this in the book in a constructive way, which is, so much of the energy we all use, it comes from oil and gas. And you also touch on the way we got here is because these fuels were better than the fuels they replaced. That's how we got here. And I think this goes back many years now, but one of the least productive sentiments in the climate discussion and in this whole debate seems to have been the demonization of oil and gas. Like it just doesn't seem to serve any real purpose. In fact, it has caused problems. It's kind of one thing to promote new things. It's another to penalize the things we're currently using. Any advice now look, we're Houston-based people that have grown up around oil and gas, and so that is our framework. But any thoughts you have on that particular piece of the puzzle and how we might, because whether you're using it or producing it, we're all part of it. And so what do you think about that piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, there is a part of the online journalism, let's in quotes, world that is dedicated to building a moral case against oil and gas companies. And I am pretty clear in the book that I think that's counterproductive to the ultimate goal, if that is their goal of reducing carbon emissions. It comes from frustration with misinformation from groups like the Heartland Institute back in the 90s and early 2000s. And that misinformation is perfectly, I would share their view of those efforts. But it's a mischaracterization of the industry to sort of think of them as, evil in that sense. They're just people engaged in a business that provides products that people still want. And even if those products were priced at a level that doesn't include all of their environmental externalities, the fact that the demand for them remains so high still reflects the fact that there's social benefits associated with using those products. And so demonizing them, to me, is counterproductive to our understanding and counterproductive to the political challenge, because why alienate or rule out of bounds a potential technology that might be helpful in a net zero future, or on the path to it, or potential allies in the form particularly of the super majors who want to pivot into things like carbon sequestration and hydrogen production, and whose expertise is extremely valuable to the geothermal industry and so on. So I don't see the reason. I don't see the value in it. I think it's not keeping your eyes on the prize. The prize is trying to get to a lower carbon economy from their point of view, not vanquishing some enemy who I have decided is evil and worthy of being vanquished.
Well, fantastic. We have been so looking forward to this, David. We all enjoyed reading the book. No matter where you stand on all these issues, this book advances the discussion and improves it. And we just owe you a debt of gratitude for coming on the show and spending time with us. We really appreciate it.
No, it's been my pleasure, Maynard. And can I just give a plug to the website associated with the book, which is www.climateofcontempt.com, which is really intended to be a resource for students and readers of the book if they want to go further in thinking and talking about these issues.
Awesome. Well, David, thank you. And thanks to all our friends out there. We appreciate you too.